The early morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at San Diego International Airport as Admiral Sarah Mitchell made her way through the terminal. She moved with quiet purposefulness, her carry-on rolling smoothly beside her, a modest leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder. To anyone observing her, she was unremarkable, just another professional making her way through the familiar ritual of air travel. The navy blazer she wore was of good quality but understated, the kind of jacket that blended seamlessly into the business-casual atmosphere of any airport. Paired with dark jeans and soft leather loafers, her outfit was practical and comfortable, chosen deliberately for the 3-hour flight ahead. At 58 years old, Admiral Mitchell carried her age with grace. Her hair, salt and pepper gray, was pulled back into a neat, professional bun that she'd maintained for the better part of 3 decades. Her face bore the subtle lines of someone who had spent countless hours studying maps, poring over classified documents, and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Her blue eyes, sharp and observant, scanned her surroundings with the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. Yet there was nothing in her demeanor that announced her significance. In fact, that was precisely the point. Admiral Sarah Mitchell had spent the last 32 years of her life climbing the ranks of the United States Navy, a career path that had consumed most of her adult existence. She had risen through the ranks with quiet determination, earned her wings as a naval aviator, commanded multiple squadrons, and eventually ascended to the position of Commander of Naval Air Forces, one of the most prestigious and demanding roles in the entire military establishment. She was responsible for oversight of all air operations across the Navy, a position that carried immense responsibility and constant demands on her attention. For decades, she had been defined by her rank, her uniform, and her role. Officers saluted her. Enlisted personnel called her Ma'am and Admiral. She attended high-level briefings, consulted with the Secretary of the Navy, and made strategic decisions that rippled across military operations worldwide. She had earned numerous commendations, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. Her name appeared in official reports and military records. But outside of her professional circle, she was virtually unknown to the general public. This anonymity, she had come to realize over the years, was one of her greatest privileges. The flight from San Diego to Washington, D.C. had been arranged through her administrative assistant. It was marked as a routine trip, another consultation, another meeting with high-ranking officials, another cycle in the relentless demands of her position. But this particular journey held different significance for her. She was attending a 3-day conference on naval strategic operations, followed by briefings with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Heavy responsibilities awaited her in the nation's capital. However, as she checked in at the ticket counter, Admiral Mitchell made a conscious decision to exist outside of her official capacity for the duration of the flight. She had arranged for her security detail and administrative team to follow on a separate flight later that afternoon. She had informed her office that she would not be available for phone calls during her travel time. For once, she could simply be another passenger, another person moving through the world without the weight of stars on her shoulder or the constant awareness of cameras and protocol. The TSA security line moved slowly that morning. Admiral Mitchell stood patiently behind a family struggling to get their young children through the screening process. She didn't pull rank or request expedited processing, didn't mention her position to any of the officers. She simply waited her turn, submitted her identification, a civilian driver's license rather than her military credentials, and proceeded through the scanner like everyone else. An older gentleman behind her tried to strike up a conversation, asking where she was headed. She replied politely but briefly, "East Coast, business meetings." He nodded and didn't press further. The gate area was typical for a morning flight, a mix of business travelers, families, and a scattering of military personnel in uniform who occasionally caught her eye with the unconscious recognition of their service. She found a seat near a window with a view of the runway, and settled in with the latest issue of a naval strategy journal she'd been meaning to read. She pulled out her phone and checked emails briefly, responding to a few administrative items, then switched it to airplane mode. She wanted to be unreachable for a while. As she sat waiting for the boarding announcement, Admiral Mitchell reflected on why these rare moments of obscurity felt so precious. For 3 decades, she had been Admiral Mitchell, a title that preceded her name, a rank that defined her identity. People didn't see her as Sarah anymore. They saw the position, the authority, the responsibility. Even her closest colleagues in the Navy related to her primarily through the lens of her rank and role. There was a formality to it all, a distance that came with the territory. But in this airport terminal, in these casual clothes, with her identification showing only her civilian name, she was simply a woman traveling to a meeting. The flight attendants would ask if she wanted coffee or juice. Fellow passengers might accidentally bump her in the aisle or ask her to move her bag. No one would defer to her or ask for her permission. No one would stand at attention in her presence. For the next 3 hours, she could exist without the weight of command, without the constant awareness of her position and its implications. The boarding announcement came, and Admiral Mitchell gathered her belongings. She stood with the other passengers in line, waiting to board in her assigned zone. She watched as families hurried aboard, as business travelers jockeyed for position, as elderly passengers were given assistance by flight attendants. She took her place among them, another ordinary traveler embarking on an ordinary flight. The uniformed Navy officers passing through the terminal paid her no special attention. The flight crew, busy with their pre-flight checklist, saw only another passenger. The businessman in line ahead of her certainly had no idea that he was standing behind one of the most senior military officers in the United States military establishment. As Admiral Mitchell made her way down the jet bridge and into the cabin of the aircraft, she felt the familiar sense of peace that came with anonymity. For these next few hours, she could simply be human, unremarkable, unobserved, and blissfully free from the expectations of her rank. She found her seat in first class, settled in, and looked out the window as the aircraft began to push back from the gate. She had no idea that this quiet flight would soon become anything but ordinary. The aircraft had been in the air for approximately 2 hours when the first signs of trouble emerged. The flight was progressing smoothly, the cabin was calm, and most passengers had settled into the routine of air travel, some reading, others sleeping, a few watching the in-flight entertainment systems. The cabin crew, led by senior flight attendant Margaret Torres, had completed their service rounds and were beginning to prepare for the final hour of the journey. Margaret had been working for the airline for 23 years and had seen nearly everything that could happen at 35,000 feet. She was professional, patient, and experienced enough to handle most situations with grace. However, she would later reflect that nothing in her 2 decades of service had quite prepared her for the man in 12D. He had boarded the flight in San Diego appearing relatively normal, a heavyset man in his early 50s, wearing a rumpled polo shirt and khaki pants. He had ordered a drink almost immediately after settling into his seat. Then another. Then another. The flight attendants, following protocol, had continued to serve him while keeping a mental note of his consumption. By the time the aircraft reached its cruising altitude, he had consumed 4 cocktails in approximately 40 minutes. The intoxication manifested itself gradually at first. He began speaking loudly to his seatmate, a nervous young woman who kept glancing toward the window as if she might wish herself out of the aircraft. When she stopped responding to his attempts at conversation, he became irritated. His voice grew louder, his language more colorful. Other passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Around the 2-hour mark, as Margaret was completing a routine cabin check, she noticed him attempting to stand up, swaying slightly in the aisle. His name was Richard Kellerman, though Margaret wouldn't learn this until later. What she did know was that he was significantly intoxicated and becoming increasingly disruptive. "Excuse me, sir, you'll need to return to your seat," Margaret said, approaching him with the calm professionalism that came from years of experience. She spoke in the firm but friendly tone that had worked with hundreds of unruly passengers before him. Kellerman turned to her with unfocused eyes. "I'm just going to the bathroom," he slurred, gesturing vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft. "No law against that, is there?" Margaret did not argue. She simply guided him toward the lavatory, waited for him to enter, and made a mental note to alert the other flight attendants to monitor his behavior more closely. She also made a discreet note in the crew log, documenting his excessive alcohol consumption. Protocol dictated that they would not serve him any more alcoholic beverages. However, when Kellerman returned to his seat approximately 10 minutes later, he had somehow acquired another drink. He claimed a flight attendant had given it to him, though this was later disputed. Regardless, his behavior began to deteriorate more rapidly. He became verbally aggressive with a flight attendant who politely declined to serve him another round. He made inappropriate comments to the young woman seated next to him, comments that made her uncomfortable enough that she requested to change seats. As the situation escalated, Margaret found herself increasingly frustrated and concerned. She consulted with the other two flight attendants on duty, and together they decided that one of them would position themselves near Kellerman to monitor the situation more closely. They could not physically restrain him or force him to comply with their requests. That required coordination with the captain and a level of intervention that was rarely necessary on commercial flights. Around the 2-hour 45-minute mark, Kellerman stood up again, this time with more aggressive intent. He began loudly criticizing the airline, complaining about everything from the quality of the food to the temperature of the cabin. When Margaret approached him to ask him to sit down, he responded with hostile language and a dismissive wave of his hand. "I paid for this ticket," he shouted, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. "I can stand where I want. I can say what I want. You can't tell me what to do." Other passengers were now visibly alarmed. A mother pulled her young daughter closer. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances. A businessman stood up as if considering whether to intervene himself. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from comfortable routine to palpable tension. Margaret maintained her composure, but her concern was genuine. She excused herself and made her way to the flight deck, where she briefly informed Captain David Hutchins of the situation. The captain, while sympathetic to her predicament, explained that as long as the passenger wasn't making direct threats or attempting to access the flight deck, their options were somewhat limited. They would continue to the destination and could arrange for local law enforcement to meet the aircraft upon arrival. However, this measured response didn't account for the fact that Kellerman's behavior was continuing to escalate. When Margaret returned to the cabin, she found him now actively harassing another passenger, a middle-aged businessman who had politely asked him to lower his voice. Kellerman was standing in the aisle, his finger jabbing in the air, making offensive comments about the man's appearance and presumed sexual orientation. When the businessman tried to ignore him and turn away, Kellerman grabbed his shoulder. This was the moment when the situation transformed from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. The businessman stood up, clearly ready to defend himself. Other passengers gasped. Margaret and the other flight attendants rushed forward, attempting to position themselves between the two men. The cabin, which had been relatively calm just minutes before, erupted into chaos. Passengers were standing, some moving away from the conflict, others craning their necks to see what was happening. A child began crying. Someone shouted, "Call the captain." Margaret's voice became sharper, more commanding. "Sir, you need to sit down immediately. Now." But Kellerman, emboldened by alcohol and whatever impulse had driven him to this point, refused to comply. He continued to be verbally abusive, now directing his hostility at Margaret herself, making crude comments about her appearance and her competence. The situation had spiraled beyond what the flight attendants could handle alone. There were no air marshals on this particular flight, a detail that would later prove significant. The captain had been alerted but remained in the flight deck, unable to leave his post. The cabin crew was outnumbered and increasingly unable to maintain control. Tension hung in the air like a physical force. Passengers watched helplessly, some reaching for their phones to record what they feared might become a serious incident. The flight still had roughly 58 minutes before landing. 58 minutes of continued exposure to an increasingly volatile and unpredictable individual. Margaret stood in the aisle, visibly stressed, trying to figure out what her next move should be. Around her, the cabin of Flight 742 had transformed from a place of routine travel into a pressure cooker of anxiety and uncertainty. No one knew that help was about to come from the most unexpected source. Admiral Sarah Mitchell had been observing the escalating situation with the quiet attention of someone trained to assess threats and evaluate circumstances rapidly. She sat in Seat 1C, first class, with a clear view of most of the cabin. Her initial response to the disturbance had been like that of most responsible passengers. She had noted the problem, assessed the risk, and waited to see how the flight crew would handle it. Conflict resolution was not her responsibility in this context. She was simply a passenger. But as she watched Margaret Torres and the other flight attendants struggle to contain Richard Kellerman, as she observed the palpable fear beginning to ripple through the cabin, as she recognized the dangerous trajectory of a situation spiraling beyond the crew's capacity to manage it, something fundamental shifted within her. It was not a conscious decision, not an intellectual calculation. It was an instinctive recognition born of 3 decades of military service, the understanding that when a crisis reaches a critical point, someone must act. She watched as Kellerman's aggression intensified, as his voice grew louder, as his gestures became more threatening. She saw Margaret's composure beginning to crack around the edges, heard the strain in the flight attendant's voice as she attempted to assert control she no longer possessed. She observed the other passengers, frightened, uncertain, looking to someone for leadership that wasn't coming from the cabin crew. Admiral Mitchell made her decision. She rose from her seat with deliberate calm, drawing her messenger bag toward her. She did not rush. She did not make sudden movements that might further agitate an already volatile situation. Instead, she moved with the measured, purposeful pace of someone who had absolute confidence in what she was about to do. Several passengers watched her as she stood, curious about what this ordinary-looking woman in the navy blazer intended to do. As she approached the area where Kellerman was still berating the businessman and Margaret, she took mental inventory of the space, the proximity of other passengers, the distance to the nearest emergency equipment, the width of the aisle, the positions of the flight attendants. Her mind worked through contingencies, assessed risks, and calculated her approach with the precision of someone accustomed to making tactical decisions under pressure. Kellerman noticed her first, his alcohol-blurred eyes focusing on this new figure approaching him. For a moment, he seemed uncertain. She was not a flight attendant, not someone whose role he immediately understood. This confusion, brief as it was, gave her the opening she needed. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the cabin with remarkable clarity. It was not loud, in fact, it was surprisingly quiet, but it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. Every syllable was precisely enunciated, every word deliberate. "I need you to step back to your seat. Now." Kellerman stared at her, momentarily disoriented by the command. Something in her bearing, the absolute certainty in her voice, the unwavering directness of her gaze, the controlled power of her posture, triggered a response in him that overrode his intoxicated defiance. This was not a request. This was a directive issued with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Who the hell are you?" he slurred, attempting to reassert his dominance. "You're not crew, you can't tell me. I'm someone who needs you to listen to what I'm saying. Admiral Mitchell interrupted, her voice remaining calm but firm. She took a measured step closer, establishing a physical presence that demanded his attention. Around them, the cabin had gone nearly silent. Passengers recognized that something significant was occurring, that someone had stepped into the void of leadership. Admiral Mitchell's years of commanding officers had taught her the language of authority, not the authority of rank or title, but the authority of absolute conviction. She spoke to Kellerman, as though the outcome of this interaction was already determined, as though his compliance was simply a matter of his choice to follow the logical course of action that she was presenting to him. "You have two options," she continued, her eyes never wavering from his face. "You can return to your seat, sit down, and not cause any further disruption for the remainder of this flight. Or you can continue this behavior, and we will restrain you using whatever means are necessary, and you will face serious legal consequences when this aircraft lands. Those are your choices." There was no anger in her voice, no judgment, no emotion whatsoever. This was the tone of someone presenting facts, not opinions. The absence of emotional investment somehow made the statement more compelling. She was not trying to convince him of anything. She was simply explaining the reality of the situation. Kellerman's face flushed with a mixture of shame and alcohol-fueled anger. For a moment, it seemed as though he might escalate further, might choose confrontation over compliance. Admiral Mitchell watched him carefully, reading the micro-expressions that crossed his face, prepared to adjust her approach if necessary. She had de-escalated volatile situations many times before, sometimes successfully, sometimes with mixed results. She knew that the next 10 seconds would be crucial. "I know you've had a difficult time," she said, her voice softening slightly, introducing a note of what might have been empathy without sacrificing authority. "But you're affecting other people now. Passengers with families, people who are frightened. The right thing to do here is to make a different choice. I'm giving you the opportunity to make that choice with dignity." That final phrase seemed to reach something in him. Dignity. It was not an appeal to his fear of legal consequences, though that remained implicit in her earlier statement. It was an appeal to something deeper, a recognition that he still had agency, still had the power to determine how this situation concluded. Kellerman's shoulders slumped slightly. The aggressive tension drained from his posture. He looked at Admiral Mitchell, then at Margaret, then at the businessman he had been harassing. The reality of what he had done, obscured by alcohol but suddenly unavoidable, seemed to crash down upon him. Okay," he said quietly, his voice losing its hostile edge. "Okay, I'll sit down." "Thank you," Admiral Mitchell said, and she meant it. "That's the right decision." She guided him back to his seat with a hand on his elbow, maintaining the same calm authority that had convinced him to stand down. She did not lecture him or shame him further. She simply ensured he was seated, then caught Margaret's eye. The flight attendant's expression was a mixture of gratitude, relief, and bewilderment. The cabin, which moments before had been a pressure cooker of anxiety and tension, seemed to exhale collectively. Passengers began to settle back into their seats. The child who had been crying quieted down. The businessman returned to his seat, visibly shaken but no longer in immediate danger. Admiral Mitchell returned to her seat in first class, where she calmly resumed reading her journal as though nothing of significance had occurred. Around her, however, quiet conversations began, whispers of amazement at how this ordinary-looking woman had accomplished what the flight crew could not. No one yet realized that they had witnessed military leadership in its purest form. The remainder of the flight was marked by a distinctly different atmosphere than what had preceded the confrontation. The immediate crisis had passed, but a new form of tension, one born of curiosity and speculation, permeated the cabin. Passengers who had been frightened moments before were now intrigued. The woman in 1C had become the subject of intense, if whispered, scrutiny. Margaret Torres found herself unable to focus on her routine duties. As she moved through the cabin performing her post-crisis checks, her mind kept returning to the interaction she had witnessed. In her 23 years as a flight attendant, she had seen conflicts resolved in various ways: by the assertion of crew authority, by physical intervention from other passengers, by the presence of federal air marshals, and occasionally by the simple passage of time and the sobering influence of altitude. But she had never witnessed anything quite like what had just occurred. The woman's composure had been extraordinary. Her voice had carried an unmistakable weight of command, not the trained authority of customer service, but something deeper, something born of genuine leadership. The way she had presented Kellerman with choices rather than ultimatums had been masterful, and the final appeal to his dignity, that had been particularly revealing. Most people in an angry confrontation did not think in such sophisticated psychological terms. They reacted emotionally or relied on protocol. This woman had maneuvered through the interaction with the precision of someone who had extensive experience managing volatile personalities. As Margaret completed her cabin checks, she made a deliberate decision. She would approach the woman in 1C and thank her personally. Beyond gratitude, she wanted to gather more information, to satisfy her growing curiosity about who this passenger really was. She found Admiral Mitchell precisely where she had returned, in her first-class seat, reading her journal with apparent concentration. However, Margaret noticed that the Admiral's eyes had remained on the same page for nearly 10 minutes without apparent progress. She was not as unaffected by the incident as her demeanor suggested. "Excuse me, ma'am," Margaret said quietly, approaching her seat. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you did back there. That was extraordinary. Honestly, I've never seen anything like it." Admiral Mitchell closed her journal and looked up at Margaret with polite but measured attention. "I'm simply glad the situation resolved peacefully," she said. "You and your colleagues handled a very difficult circumstance with professionalism." It was a diplomatic response, well crafted to deflect further inquiry while acknowledging Margaret's role. However, Margaret was not easily deterred. "With respect, ma'am, that wasn't just standard de-escalation technique," Margaret said carefully. "The way you spoke to him, the authority in your voice, that's something you don't learn from a customer service manual. May I ask what you do for a living?" Admiral Mitchell smiled slightly, a gesture that conveyed warmth while simultaneously maintaining boundaries. "I work in management," she said, "in a field where clear communication and decision-making under pressure are important skills. Beyond that, I prefer to keep my professional details private." It was an answer that was technically truthful while being thoroughly evasive. Management was one way to describe the command of naval air forces. Clear communication and pressure were certainly hallmarks of her position, but it revealed nothing specific, nothing that would satisfy Margaret's genuine curiosity. Margaret recognized the polite but firm boundary the woman had established. She accepted the limitation with grace, thanked the Admiral once more, and returned to her duties. But as she moved through the cabin, she found herself increasingly aware of her passenger in 1C. The whispers had already begun among other passengers. By the time Margaret returned to the galley, the two other flight attendants had already been approached multiple times by curious travelers with variations of the same question. Who was that woman who stopped the guy from causing trouble? Word traveled through the cabin with the inevitable speed of aircraft gossip. By the time an hour had passed, nearly every passenger had heard some version of the story. Those who had witnessed the event directly provided accounts to those who hadn't. Details became slightly embellished with each retelling. The woman's bearing became more impressive, her command more absolute, her composure more remarkable. In seat 3B, a businessman named David Chen, who had been seated near the confrontation, found himself engaged in conversation with a woman across the aisle named Patricia Olson. They were both trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. "I'm telling you that wasn't normal," Patricia said in a low voice. "I've worked in corporate environments for 30 years. I've seen people in positions of authority before. That woman had something different. That was military bearing." David nodded slowly. I thought the same thing. Did you see how she positioned herself? The way she assessed the situation before she moved. That's not something civilians typically do without training. Exactly, Patricia agreed. And the way she spoke. No hesitation, no doubt in her voice. She didn't ask him to sit down. She informed him that he would sit down. And he did because some part of him recognized that she wasn't someone he could argue with. In Seat 8F, a retired Army colonel named James Henderson sat with his arms crossed, watching the woman in 1C with practiced observation. He had served for 34 years before retirement and had spent much of that time around senior military personnel. He recognized the qualities he was seeing: the controlled alertness, the economical movements, the absolute confidence that came only from extensive experience with genuine authority and responsibility. Back in first class, Admiral Mitchell was acutely aware of the attention she was receiving, though she gave no outward sign of noticing. She had lived with scrutiny for decades. The nature of her position demanded it. However, there was something unsettling about being observed without her rank and uniform to contextualize the observation. People were making assumptions based on behavioral cues alone, and several of those assumptions, she suspected, were uncomfortably close to the truth. She felt the weight of the gazes, heard the muffled conversations, recognized the speculation in the nervous glances that came her way. Her intervention, intended simply as a responsible action by a concerned passenger, had transformed her into an object of mystery. The anonymity she had sought at the beginning of this flight was rapidly evaporating. She considered her options. She could try to diminish the incident, to present herself as merely lucky or naturally assertive. But the truth was that what the passengers had witnessed was genuine, the product of 3 decades of military leadership and training. Any attempt to downplay it would ring false. Alternatively, she could retreat further into privacy, refuse engagement with curious passengers, and hope that the incident would fade into the background as the flight progressed toward its conclusion. The most prudent course was silence. Say nothing more, offer nothing additional, and allow the mystery to remain a mystery. In 53 minutes, this aircraft would land at Reagan National Airport. These passengers would disembark and return to their lives. Most would forget this incident within a few days, though a few might retain the memory of the remarkable woman who had intervened in a crisis. Admiral Mitchell returned her attention to her journal, though her mind remained acutely aware of the questions circulating through the cabin, the theories being developed, the growing certainty among certain passengers that she was far more than she had presented herself to be. She had no way of knowing that this curiosity, this growing suspicion about her true identity, would soon lead to a confrontation that would force her hand and reveal everything she had attempted to keep private. The final hour of the flight suddenly felt far more consequential than she had anticipated. The descent into Reagan National Airport began with the familiar announcements about seatbelt fastening and the stowing of electronic devices. Outside the windows, the landscape shifted from the distant horizon to increasingly defined geography, the patterns of suburban development becoming clearer as the aircraft descended through the Virginia airspace. Admiral Mitchell watched the familiar landscape with the knowledge that her quiet journey was about to become significantly more complicated. Protocol dictated that any significant disruption during a commercial flight would be documented and reported to airport authorities. As the aircraft began its approach, Margaret Torres was in the flight deck providing Captain Hutchins with a formal written account of the incident with Richard Kellerman. The captain, in turn, was filing his mandatory report with air traffic control. By the time the wheels touched down on the tarmac at Reagan National, law enforcement personnel had already been alerted and were preparing to meet the aircraft. The landing was smooth and professional. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Admiral Mitchell observed the 2 police vehicles and 1 TSA vehicle positioned near the terminal building. She had anticipated this. The confrontation had been serious enough to warrant official documentation and statements. She prepared herself mentally for the interviews that would inevitably follow. The first passengers to disembark were those in business class, situated near the front of the aircraft. However, before the general disembarkation process could begin, two uniformed police officers and a woman in TSA credentials boarded the aircraft through the forward galley. Margaret immediately guided them toward the area where Richard Kellerman was seated. That interview would need to occur first to establish the baseline facts of the incident. Kellerman, now visibly sober and mortified by his actions, cooperated fully with the officers. He provided his identification, answered questions about his intoxication and behavior, and did not resist when they informed him that he would be questioned further upon arrival at the gate. Within 15 minutes, he had been escorted from the aircraft, his travel day transformed into something far more complicated by the consequences of his earlier actions. As Kellerman was being removed, one of the officers approached Margaret. "We'll need statements from crew members and any passengers who witnessed the incident," he said. "Can you direct us to anyone else involved?" Margaret hesitated briefly, then gestured toward the first-class cabin. "There's a passenger who intervened and de-escalated the situation. She's in 1C without her. I honestly don't know how that situation would have ended." The officer and the TSA agent exchanged glances. This was not a typical in-flight incident report. Most of the time, the crew had handled the problem or air marshals had been present. It was unusual for a civilian passenger to have taken such direct action. Admiral Mitchell saw them approaching before they reached her seat. She had already gathered her belongings and was prepared for the conversation she knew was inevitable. She stood gracefully as they arrived, extending her identification. "Admiral, ma'am," the first officer began, clearly surprised by what he was seeing on her civilian driver's license. "We're collecting statements regarding the incident that occurred during this flight. We understand you were involved in de-escalating the situation with the disruptive passenger." "That's correct," Admiral Mitchell said calmly. "I observed that the flight crew was overwhelmed by the passenger's behavior and that the situation was escalating to a point where someone could have been injured. I felt it was appropriate to intervene." The TSA agent, a woman named Sarah Winters in her mid-50s, was studying Admiral Mitchell with an intensity that suggested she was performing her own assessment. She had worked in airport security for 18 years and had developed keen instincts for reading people. But there was something else, something in the way the Admiral carried herself, in the measured precision of her words, in the absolute composure of her demeanor. "Can you walk us through exactly what happened?" Officer Rodriguez asked, pulling out a notebook. "From your perspective." Admiral Mitchell provided a clear, chronological account of the incident. She described Kellerman's increasingly aggressive behavior, Margaret's professional but ultimately insufficient attempts at de-escalation, and her own decision to intervene. She explained her approach, her language choices, and the passenger's eventual compliance. She spoke like someone providing a formal military briefing, precise, organized, complete, and entirely devoid of dramatization. As she spoke, TSA Agent Winters continued to observe her closely. Something was triggering her instincts, and she was trying to identify exactly what. It was not anything specific that Admiral Mitchell had said. It was rather the totality of how she presented herself, the bearing, the vocabulary, the way she seemed to evaluate people and situations with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to responsibility and authority. "How did you know exactly what to say to calm him down?" Officer Rodriguez asked. "That's not something most civilians would know how to handle." "I've spent my career in management and organizational leadership," Admiral Mitchell replied, which was technically accurate if somewhat incomplete. "De-escalation techniques are tools anyone in a supervisory position should develop." But Winters was leaning forward slightly now, her eyes narrowing with recognition. Something the Admiral had said, combined with the way she had said it, had triggered a memory. The structured communication style, the emphasis on organizational hierarchy, the calm authority that seemed almost automatic, these were not the markers of a corporate manager. These were the hallmarks of military training. "Ma'am," Winters said, her voice taking on a different quality, "I have to ask, have you served in the military?" There was a fractional pause before Admiral Mitchell responded. It was barely perceptible, less than a second of hesitation, but it was enough. In that brief moment, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Her eyes acknowledged the accuracy of the question. "Yes," she said simply, "I have." Officer Rodriguez looked up from his notebook, clearly expecting more information. "What branch?" he asked. "And what was your rank?" Admiral Mitchell recognized at this point that the facade of anonymity was crumbling. The TSA agent had identified something fundamental about her bearing that could not be concealed. She had two options. She could continue to be evasive, which would only fuel suspicion and potentially create problems with airport authorities, or she could acknowledge the truth. She made her decision. "Navy," she said quietly, "career naval officer." "How many years of service?" Winters asked, her tone now carrying the respect that came with military recognition. 32 years, Admiral Mitchell said. The words hung in the air. Officer Rodriguez's pen paused over his notebook. TSA Agent Winters leaned back slightly, her eyes still fixed on the Admiral, her mind clearly processing the implications of this information. A 32-year naval career suggested not a junior officer, not even a mid-level commander, but someone with significant rank and responsibility. "And your current rank?" Winters asked carefully, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would be substantial. Admiral Mitchell met the TSA agent's eyes directly. The moment of truth had arrived. The flight had landed. She was at the gate. Her identity, her anonymity, her attempt to exist as simply another passenger had culminated in this moment. "Admiral," she said, "2 stars, Naval Air Forces." The words created an immediate shift in the dynamics of the conversation. Officer Rodriguez's eyes widened in recognition of what this meant. Winters nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "Admiral Sarah Mitchell," Winters said, and it was a statement, not a question. "Commander of Naval Air Forces. You intervened in a civilian aircraft disruption while traveling incognito. That's quite a story." Admiral Mitchell said nothing, simply waited to see what would happen next. The secret was out. The revelation she had hoped to avoid for just a few more minutes had occurred. The interrogation, she realized, was far from over. The moment Admiral Mitchell acknowledged her rank and position, everything changed. Officer Rodriguez and TSA Agent Winters exchanged a glance that communicated the sudden gravity of the situation. What had begun as a routine incident report had transformed into something far more significant: the documentation of a 2-star admiral's intervention in a civilian aircraft disruption. "Admiral Mitchell," Winters said, her professional demeanor shifting into something more deferential, "we appreciate your service and your actions on the flight. We'll need to file a comprehensive report, but I want to assure you that this situation is being handled with appropriate protocols." Admiral Mitchell nodded, understanding the implication. As a high-ranking military officer, her involvement in this incident would require coordination across multiple agencies: the FAA, the TSA, potentially the Department of Defense, and certainly her own chain of command within the Navy. What should have been a simple passenger statement was now a matter of official military and civilian record. "I understand," she said. "I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation or official documentation you require." Officer Rodriguez was already making notes about her rank and position. "Admiral, we'll need to contact your commanding officer or administrative staff to verify your credentials and inform them of this incident. Is there someone we should reach out to?" Admiral Mitchell provided the contact information for her administrative assistant, Commander James Mitchell, no relation, who was scheduled to arrive at Reagan National on a later flight. She also provided her official military identification number and explained that her security detail would be arriving within the hour. As the officers worked through the formal documentation, other airport security personnel had begun to circulate information about what was transpiring. Word traveled quickly through the channels of TSA, airport operations, and local law enforcement. By the time Admiral Mitchell had completed her formal statement, at least a dozen airport personnel were aware of her identity and presence. The passengers who had disembarked from the flight were beginning to disperse through the terminal when the information started to reach them through various channels. David Chen, the businessman who had been so intrigued by the Admiral's intervention, was waiting for his luggage when he received a call from a friend who worked in airport management. "David, you're not going to believe who was on your flight," his friend said. "The woman who stopped that guy from causing trouble. She's a 2-star admiral in the Navy. Admiral Sarah Mitchell, commander of Naval Air Forces. She was traveling incognito." The confirmation of what Chen and others had suspected sent a ripple of excitement through the terminals. Social media, that ever-present recorder of significant moments, began to activate. Passengers who had been on Flight 742 started posting about what they had witnessed, adding crucial details now that they knew the woman's actual identity and position. Meanwhile, Margaret Torres was sharing what had transpired with her colleagues in the crew lounge. Her story, already impressive in its basic facts, had taken on a new dimension with the revelation of Admiral Mitchell's rank and position. The senior flight attendant who had been so overwhelmed by the incident suddenly became part of a far larger narrative. "She's the commander of Naval Air Forces," Margaret told her fellow attendants, still processing the information. "Do you understand what that means? She's responsible for all naval air operations, and she was just sitting in first class reading a journal while one passenger was causing chaos." In the airport's executive offices, calls were being made to various departments. Airport Director Michael Harrison was informed that a 2-star admiral had been involved in the in-flight incident and that appropriate protocols should be followed. Discussions began about security, media relations, and the proper handling of an incident involving such a high-ranking military officer. Admiral Mitchell, in the meantime, had been escorted to a private interview room, a courtesy typically extended to VIP passengers, but now applied with military protocols in mind. She waited there while her credentials were being verified through official military channels. Within 40 minutes, her administrative assistant, Commander Mitchell, had been contacted and was en route from wherever he had been in the terminal. The revelation of her identity triggered a cascade of notifications through military channels as well. Her immediate superior officers were being informed of the incident. The chain of command was being notified that Admiral Sarah Mitchell had been involved in a civilian aviation incident that had required her personal intervention to resolve. Emails began to circulate through Naval Air Forces headquarters in San Diego, documenting the basic facts of what had occurred. As the formal process unfolded, Admiral Mitchell found herself contemplating the complete dissolution of the privacy she had sought. She had left San Diego that morning hoping for a few hours of anonymity, a few hours of existing simply as Sarah rather than as Admiral Mitchell. That hope had been definitively eliminated by Richard Kellerman's intoxication and her own instinctive response to a crisis. The media, however, was not far behind. An airport operations manager named David Torres, no relation to Margaret Torres, had a brother who worked for a local news station. A casual text message, "You won't believe who was on the flight that had that disturbance," had initiated the process of media inquiry. Within 2 hours, at least 3 local news crews were en route to Reagan National Airport with vague information about a significant incident involving a high-ranking military officer. Commander James Mitchell arrived to find his admiral in the private interview room, completing the final stages of documentation. His expression when he learned what had transpired oscillated between amazement and concern. A two-star admiral involved in a civilian incident was not a routine matter, and the media interest that was already beginning to form suggested this would quickly become a public story. "Admiral," he said quietly, "the news crews are already gathering in the terminal. Word is spreading. We need to coordinate a response and prepare for the media inquiries that are inevitable." Admiral Mitchell took a moment to absorb this information. The story was no longer contained. It was no longer simply a matter of official military documentation and incident reports. It was becoming public knowledge, and within hours it would be distributed across news networks and social media platforms worldwide. "Contact the Navy Public Affairs Office," she instructed Commander Mitchell. "Inform them of the situation and indicate that I will be available for a brief statement if they deem it appropriate. But emphasize that this incident should be contextualized around the professionalism of the flight crew and the quick resolution of a potentially serious situation. I will not be pursuing any publicity over this matter." Commander Mitchell nodded, understanding the Admiral's intent. She wanted to control the narrative to the extent possible, ensuring that the focus remained on the responsible handling of a crisis rather than on her personally. It was a thoughtful approach, but it could not prevent the story from becoming public, from being analyzed and discussed, from entering the collective awareness of the nation. As Admiral Mitchell gathered her belongings and prepared to exit the interview room, she could already hear the sound of camera equipment and reporter activity in the terminal beyond. The quiet, anonymous journey that had begun so carefully that morning in San Diego had transformed into something far different. Her identity was no longer a secret. Her extraordinary leadership was no longer known only to those who had witnessed it directly. The admiral who had preferred invisibility was about to become very visible indeed. The world was about to learn the story of who she really was. By 6:47 p.m. Eastern Time, the story of Admiral Sarah Mitchell had appeared on the first local news broadcast covering the Washington, D.C. area. The report was initially brief, relying on the limited information that had been released through official channels and the accounts of passengers who had been present on the flight. However, the narrative was compelling enough to capture immediate attention. A two-star admiral, traveling incognito in casual clothes, had single-handedly prevented a dangerous situation on a commercial flight by using nothing but calm authority and precise communication. The local news segment generated immediate online traction. Within minutes, the story had been picked up by regional news networks. Within an hour, it had reached the major national news outlets. By 8:15 p.m., it was trending on multiple social media platforms, with the hashtag #Admiral Mitchell beginning to accumulate thousands of posts. David Chen, the businessman who had been on the flight, found himself contacted by 3 different news organizations before he had even left the airport. He provided interviews describing what he had witnessed, offering his perspective on the admiral's leadership and composure. His account, coming from a credible civilian eyewitness, added legitimacy to the emerging narrative. Patricia Olson, who had been another astute observer, was interviewed by CNN. She provided her analysis of Admiral Mitchell's bearing and the unmistakable military nature of her intervention. "I've worked in corporate America for 30 years, she told the interviewer. "I've met CEOs and executives in positions of significant authority. What I witnessed on that flight was something different. That was military leadership in its purest form." This woman didn't ask for compliance. She commanded respect simply by being who she is. The story expanded rapidly beyond the immediate facts of what had occurred. News organizations began researching Admiral Sarah Mitchell's background, her career trajectory, and her significance within the military establishment. They discovered that she was not merely a high-ranking officer. She was one of the most senior women in the United States Navy, someone who had broken significant barriers and risen to positions of unprecedented responsibility and authority. Major news networks began developing more comprehensive pieces about her service record. Her Wikipedia page, previously a straightforward biography used primarily by military researchers and defense analysts, suddenly experienced a surge in views. News archives were pulled. Interviews she had given years ago at military conferences were located and analyzed, and her professional reputation was thoroughly documented. By 10 p.m., all three major network news programs had covered the story as their lead story. Anchors described the incident with emphasis on the danger it might have posed had it not been de-escalated, on the Admiral's remarkable composure, and on the contrast between her unassuming appearance and her significant position. Graphics showed her official military portrait alongside images from the aircraft. Commentators speculated about what might have happened had she not been present on the flight. Social media, however, was where the story truly exploded. Twitter users shared variations of the headline. Instagram posts featured images of Admiral Mitchell, most of them the official military photograph that had been released to media outlets. Reddit threads debated the technical aspects of her de-escalation approach, with military personnel and civilians alike analyzing her word choices and tactics. The hashtag #Admiral Mitchell accumulated hundreds of thousands of posts within the first few hours. The narrative crystallized around a central theme. This was a story about quiet leadership, about character transcending rank, about the kind of authority that comes from genuine competence and integrity rather than from titles or uniforms. Military personnel found the story particularly resonant. Retired service members shared it across veteran networks and military family groups. Active duty personnel discussed it in barracks and aboard ships. The story became a source of pride within military communities, a reminder of the qualities they valued and aspired to emulate. The military leadership hashtag began circulating alongside Admiral Mitchell. Military analysts published opinion pieces analyzing what the incident revealed about effective leadership principles. One retired general, writing for a major military publication, suggested that Admiral Mitchell's actions offered a masterclass in strategic communication and conflict resolution that should be taught in military academies. Female military personnel, in particular, found the story meaningful. Admiral Mitchell had broken barriers to reach her position, one of very few women who had achieved flag rank in the Navy. Her actions on the flight seemed to embody the very qualities that had enabled her to rise through a traditionally male-dominated institution. Civilian leadership experts began to weigh in as well. Business schools considered how the incident illustrated principles applicable to corporate management. Psychology professors discussed the de-escalation techniques and their effectiveness. Communications specialists analyzed the language choices that had proven so persuasive. News organizations began to expand their coverage beyond the immediate incident. They reported on Admiral Mitchell's previous achievements, her previous commands, her role in strategic naval operations. They discussed her reputation within military circles as an exceptionally capable and respected leader. They highlighted the statistic that she was one of only a handful of women to achieve admiral rank in Navy history. By midnight, the story had become genuinely national news. It appeared on network news programs across the country. International news organizations began to pick it up, translating the story for European and Asian audiences. The BBC ran a feature on the American admiral who de-escalated a flight. The Japan Times published an article about military leadership and civilian responsibility. Margaret Tors, the flight attendant, found herself becoming something of a minor celebrity. She gave interviews describing her perspective as a professional dealing with a crisis, and she consistently emphasized Admiral Mitchell's crucial role in preventing what could have been a far more serious situation. Her genuine gratitude toward the Admiral came across powerfully in every interview she gave. Richard Kellerman, the passenger whose intoxication had precipitated the entire incident, found himself the subject of significantly less flattering media coverage. News outlets tracked down information about him, reported on his background, and discussed the seriousness of his actions. The focus, however, remained on Admiral Mitchell rather than on Kellerman. The story was about leadership and responsibility, not about the disruption itself. By the next morning, Admiral Mitchell's photograph had appeared in newspapers across the country. Major publications ran feature stories about her career, her achievements, and her character. The New York Times published a comprehensive profile. The Washington Post ran an analysis of women in military leadership. Time magazine featured her on its website with a headline reading, "The Admiral Who Preferred Anonymity: How Sarah Mitchell's Quiet Leadership Inspired a Nation." Social media continued to explode with activity. Millions of people who had never heard of Admiral Sarah Mitchell before the previous evening were now discussing her, sharing the story, and reflecting on what her actions meant. Trending topics included variations on her name, military leadership, and civilian responsibility. The story had transcended the particulars of the incident itself. It had become something larger, a narrative about what authentic leadership looks like, about the qualities that inspire respect and compliance without force, about the power of character and competence. Admiral Mitchell, who had begun the day seeking a few hours of anonymity and privacy, had instead become something of a cultural phenomenon. Her quiet intervention had resonated with millions of people across the country who saw in her actions a reflection of values they valued: courage, composure, responsibility, and the willingness to act when circumstances demanded it. The story was no longer about what happened on Flight 742. It had become a national conversation about leadership, military service, and the kind of character that transcended rank or uniform. 4 days after Flight 742 had landed at Reagan National Airport, Admiral Sarah Mitchell stood in a small press conference room at Naval Air Force's headquarters in San Diego. The room was crowded with members of the media, their cameras and recording devices positioned carefully to capture her statement. She wore her full dress uniform, the first time she had done so since the incident, with her 2 stars prominently displayed on her shoulders. She had arranged for this statement deliberately, wanting to address the national conversation that had erupted around her actions. The press conference was not intended to glorify herself or capitalize on the publicity. Instead, it was carefully designed to redirect the narrative toward what she felt truly mattered. Commander James Mitchell stood to her left, and beside him was Captain Margaret Torres, the flight attendant, who had agreed to participate in the statement. Admiral Mitchell stepped to the microphone, and the room immediately quieted. Her demeanor was calm and measured, as it had been on the flight itself. She had prepared remarks, but they were brief. She had no interest in lengthy speeches or extensive elaboration. "I want to address the significant media attention that has surrounded the incident on Flight 742, she began, her voice clear and authoritative. "While I appreciate the kind words many have offered, I believe it's important to contextualize what occurred in that aircraft and to redirect the focus toward what actually matters in this situation. The incident involved a passenger who was intoxicated and whose behavior was escalating in ways that posed a genuine risk to the safety and security of everyone aboard that aircraft. The flight crew, under the leadership of Margaret Torres and her colleagues, responded professionally and with appropriate concern for passenger safety. They were placed in a difficult situation, one that they handled with composure and integrity. My actions were straightforward. I observed a developing crisis, assessed that I was in a position to potentially help, and took what seemed to me to be a reasonable and responsible course of action. Any person, regardless of rank or background, should be willing to act when circumstances demand it and when they have the capacity to help. I want to be clear about something. Leadership is not about rank. It is not about titles or uniforms or the number of stars on your shoulder. Real leadership is about character. It is about being willing to take responsibility, to act with integrity, and to make decisions that prioritize the safety and well-being of others over personal comfort or convenience. What occurred on that flight was not extraordinary. What would have been extraordinary is if I had observed a dangerous situation and chosen not to respond. In a functioning society, we depend on each other to act responsibly when we are in a position to do so. Admiral Mitchell paused, looking directly at the assembled media. The story that has circulated focuses on me, but the real story should focus on the quality of people who work in civilian and military service, people like Margaret Torres and her flight crew, who maintain professionalism and composure under genuine pressure. These are the people who deserve recognition and gratitude. These are the examples we should be celebrating. I have spent 32 years in military service because I believe in the values that service represents: duty, honor, integrity, and a commitment to something larger than oneself. Those values are not unique to the military. They exist in every profession and every community. They exist in every person who chooses to act responsibly when circumstances demand it. If the incident on Flight 742 has sparked any conversation worth having, I hope it is about the importance of cultivating leadership qualities in every aspect of our society. I hope it reminds us that we all have a responsibility to act with integrity and to make choices that prioritize the well-being of others. I hope it emphasizes that true leadership comes from character, not from rank or authority. She looked toward Margaret Torres. I want to publicly acknowledge Captain Torres and her colleagues for their professionalism and their commitment to passenger safety. They did their jobs with integrity, and I was honored to support their efforts. Admiral Mitchell concluded her brief remarks. I will not be taking questions. I have said what I came to say. I will now return to my duties as Commander of Naval Air Forces, duties that I take seriously and that demand my complete focus and attention. Thank you. The room erupted with shouted questions as Admiral Mitchell stepped away from the microphone. But she did not turn back. She walked from the press conference room with the same composed bearing she had demonstrated throughout the entire incident. In the weeks that followed, the intense media attention gradually subsided, as it inevitably does. The news cycle moved on to other stories, other controversies, other dramatic events. But the impact of Admiral Mitchell's actions and her subsequent statement continued to resonate in ways both visible and subtle. Military academies began incorporating the incident into their leadership curriculum. Instructors used the Flight 742 situation as a teaching tool, analyzing Admiral Mitchell's approach and the principles underlying her de-escalation technique. The incident became a case study in what effective leadership actually looks like. Not the dramatic, forceful assertion of authority, but the quiet confidence that comes from genuine competence and integrity. Business schools across the country featured the story in their courses on organizational leadership and crisis management. Professors assigned students to analyze the communication techniques Admiral Mitchell had employed and to consider how those techniques might apply to corporate environments. The conversation about women in military leadership intensified. Admiral Mitchell's achievement in reaching a 2-star rank and a position of such significance was contextualized within the broader history of women's progress in the military. Her actions on Flight 742, far from being diminished by her gender, seemed to underscore the importance of ensuring that positions of leadership were genuinely open to all qualified personnel, regardless of gender. Margaret Torres received commendations from her airline for her handling of the incident and her subsequent media interviews. She became something of a spokesperson for professional customer service and passenger safety, appearing at industry conferences to discuss crisis management in aviation. Richard Kellerman, the passenger whose intoxication had precipitated the entire situation, completed a court-ordered substance abuse rehabilitation program. His legal proceedings resulted in probation and mandated alcohol education courses. He eventually wrote a letter to Admiral Mitchell apologizing for his behavior, though she never publicly responded to it. Admiral Mitchell returned to her duties as commander of naval air forces with complete focus and dedication. If anything, the incident seemed to deepen her commitment to her work and her concern for the personnel under her command. She implemented new training protocols, emphasizing leadership development and ethical decision-making at all levels of command. Years later, when asked about the incident in interviews or speeches, Admiral Mitchell would offer variations on the same essential message. Leadership is character. Rank is temporary, but integrity is permanent. The quiet willingness to do the right thing when circumstances demand it is the foundation of all genuine leadership. The story of Flight 742 became part of American military and cultural folklore. It was the story that proved you didn't need dramatic declarations or authoritarian assertion to command respect. You needed character. You needed competence. You needed the willingness to act responsibly when it mattered. Admiral Sarah Mitchell's legacy was not defined by her rank or her position, though those were certainly significant. It was defined by a moment when she chose to act with integrity, by the way she de-escalated a crisis through the sheer force of her character, and by her consistent refusal to accept credit for simply doing what any responsible person should do. The admiral who had wanted to travel as simply another person had instead become a symbol of what genuine leadership looks like: quiet, confident, focused on responsibility rather than recognition, and ultimately far more powerful than any assertion of authority ever could be.